Well, good morning. Happy Tuesday to you. It is Tuesday, July 15th, 2025. A beautiful day in the neighborhood. We got a little bit of rain last night. I don't know if you had any rain last night, but we had, well, actually, it was maybe 3 or 4 o'clock or so yesterday. It rained it spit, basically, for maybe 15 minutes or something like that. But that was kind of cool. And even though it's not a heavy rain, it's enough to give you that smell of the creosote, the wet creosote, that first rain of the year. It's just so beautiful. And I love the desert rain. I truly do love the desert rain. I think it's particularly here in Vail, where it's a higher elevation, it cools things down. We knew it was going to rain because it cools it down before it rains. Let's see. And today is a very, very special day. We have 2 birthdays today. The first birthday is John Reed. Happy birthday, John. And the next birthday is Jennifer Hook. So happy birthday to my wife. Just very, very, I was just going to say how many years ago she was born, but probably shouldn't do that. Anyway, happy birthday to you, my lovely, darling wife. I pray you have a beautiful day. She's out working right now, so I think she might be listening. Pretty sure she's listening, but it's her birthday, so make sure if it's possible to wish her happy birthday. And as far as other things, we will be together Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday of this week. On Friday, I head out with the youth to go to New Orleans for the National Youth Gathering, and I won't be back until late Wednesday night. So we won't meet all week next week, and then we're back again until September. I believe that Jennifer and I will be gone for a week in September. But other than that, we should be here. All right, let's go ahead and get into our study. We are in Leviticus chapter 6. And we are going through all the various reasons why you might do a guilt offering or sin offering or burnt offering or a grain offering. We are talking about basically sin offerings right now. And you can do an offering for sins that you know and sins that you don't know. Today we're going to talk about interesting sins against your neighbor. And let's just go ahead and get into it. This is Leviticus chapter 6, beginning at verse 1. The Lord said to Moses, if anyone sins and is unfaithful to the Lord by deceiving a neighbor about something entrusted to them or left in their care, or about something stolen, or if they cheat their neighbor, or if they find lost property and lie about it, or if they swear falsely about any such sin that people may commit. When they sin in any of these ways and realize their guilt, they must return what they have stolen or taken by extortion, or what was entrusted to them, or the lost property they found, or whatever it was they swore falsely about. They must make restitution in full, add a fifth of the value to it, and give it all to the owner on the day they present their guilt offering. And as a penalty, they must bring to the priest, that is, to the Lord, their guilt offering, a ram from the flock, one without defect and of the proper value. In this way, the priest will make atonement for them before the Lord, and they will be forgiven for any of the things that they did that made them guilty. All right, so, man, a lot here. First of all, this is talking about your neighbor. So these are the people you work with. And you could work with them or you live with them. When we think of our neighbor, we think of our neighbor next door. I have a neighbor right next door in a house in a subdivision, and I know him, and that's what. But in this time, a neighbor is basically somebody that's not your family that lives in your community, right? And back in the days when we live in such a bizarre time in history. Back 100 years ago, your neighbor was somebody that you knew intimately. I know my neighbor. We've lived. I think he moved in maybe 10 years ago, and we've talked. Oh, I don't know, a couple dozen times. But I mean, he's not. I don't know him intimately, and all the things about his life intimately. But that is not the case 100 years ago. I mean, you knew your neighbor very, very well, and you pretty much lived life with your neighbor. And so your neighbor was not your family, but was somebody with which you had regular dealings with on a regular basis. We live in our houses at night, and then we live outside of our houses today. We live outside of our houses during the day, so we don't interact with our neighbors near as much, I think, as history would have it. At least I don't. And what happens? These are interesting sins for a lot of cheat your neighbor. If you cheat your neighbor, well, don't you know if you're cheating your neighbor? Isn't that something that you're pretty much? It's not like you accidentally cheat your neighbor. I think this is a willful intent to steal from your neighbor. Thou shalt not steal. So, or if they leave something in your care, and you don't care for it. I mean, these are things that you can do with your neighbor, or their things, or their ownership. Once you realize you do this, what would be something, a neighbor leaves with you, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, a cow or a lamb or something like that. And the lamb is, you forget to water or feed or whatever the property, and the lamb dies. Well, you must return to your neighbor, right, the property, and you have to add to it 20%. It's a tax. It's a guilt tax. If you steal something from the neighbor, and then you realize that, I mean, how can you steal something and not realize it? But if you steal something and then you give it back at the sin offering, you have to give it back at 20%. And so the good news is that this is a disincentive to steal from your neighbor, because once it's found out, you have to give back 20% more. Now, what's interesting, and I'm pretty sure I've shared this story before, but when we lived in Denver, we lived next door to a house that was owned by a conglomeration of churches. And when missionaries would go from one of these churches to the missionary field and they would come back, they had the opportunity to stay in this house and recover from the missionary field, get their feet back on the ground before they figured out, okay, what's the next chapter of my life? What money do I have available? Where am I going to live? What am I going to do? And that transition from the missionary field could take as little as a month. I think there was the least amount that somebody was there in as much as 2 years. We had one family that was there for a couple years. They had 3 kids. Wonderful family. We have one guy that came back, and when you're on the missionary field, you're not gaining income. You're not putting away Social Security. You're not. There's just when you come back, it could, and it might be that you're coming back under circumstances that you never anticipated. Maybe your plan was to die in the mission field, so you didn't have to worry about the United States and how the United States handles these things. But there were times when, either for political reasons or Secretary of State reasons or war reasons, although you wouldn't necessarily leave for a war, but sometimes there's forces beyond your control that force you to come back to the United States. Let me put it that way. I think in this case, the wife got sick, and the medical system in the country they were coming from was not good enough to handle this situation. So they came back to the United States. Of course, they have no income. They have nothing. And then they have to figure out what they're going to do. In this case, the guy had a brother who had a farm in Kansas. And so the plan was to put a small house on a corner of the farm in Kansas. And that's how he was going to live the rest of his life. But that takes a little bit of time. Anyway, so you come back from the missionary field. And one of the missionaries came back, and I'm always curious about what other cultures do. And you want to ask questions about how cool it is to live in a different culture. And because when I've traveled to different countries, I haven't traveled at all to Africa, but I've traveled to Eastern Europe, Western Europe, Mexico. And I've been able to experience some of those deeply different cultures. And I've found them to be very, very exciting and enjoyable, except for Russia. I did not like Russia. This was Russia during the Cold War. And Russia during the Cold War, they did not like Americans. And they led a completely different lifestyle that it didn't like. Anyway, that's a different story for a different time. So the guy from Africa said that the hardest thing for him to wrap his brain around was that one of the highest values in that culture was being sneaky and getting away with it. And I pushed him on it. I said, "What do you mean?" He says, "If you steal something from a neighbor and the neighbor cannot prove that it is theirs and you get away with it, that's considered to be very, very honorable in that culture." And you don't even think about that. But how hard would it be to live in a culture that doesn't have "thou shalt not steal" as a primary identifying attribute of that culture? So the idea is you steal something from your neighbor, and now it's in your possession. The neighbor can't prove that it's his, but everybody in the whole community knows that it belongs to him and that you swindled him out of it, or you cheated him out of it, or you were able to get it without his knowing. And now you are considered to be on a high pedestal because you were able to swindle something out of your neighbor. And that the whole society loves this and honors this. And this is like the highest thing that you can do in that society. How hard would it be to live in that culture? And he went off and lived in his house in Kansas. But I've thought about that whole conversation a lot, because when we think about the 10 Commandments, that, thou shalt not steal, we think that if we do those things, we're going to make God angry. And at some level, we do make God angry. But really, at its root, the 10 Commandments are things that God has put into place that if you follow these things, you're going to love me and you're going to love your neighbor, and life will go well with you. It's better for you and for society and for the world if you just simply follow these 10 Commandments. Because if you don't, you end up like a society that this guy came from, where you can't trust anybody and you don't know what the truth is. And being sneaky and conniving and stealing are part of society, and just societies will fall apart if they do these things. And perhaps Western culture is at the forefront of progress, I guess you could say, because we don't live in a society where we lie, steal, and cheat, and it's honored. Like maybe there's a reason why there is so much war and famine and grief in a country that does not follow the 10 Commandments. And I believe that's the case. Now, there will probably be people that will do research into that and say, well, no, if you're a Judeo-Christian society, you have just as much of a chance at happiness as other cultures. But I don't see it. And unfortunately, I don't have the time or the resources to go investigate this and come up with a thesis and evaluate it. But my gut feeling is that it would be very, 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 very hard to live in a society where you cheat your neighbor and it's honored. I think that would be like the worst thing about society. But there are societies apparently that do this. And this missionary guy lived in one. And he said it was the most difficult thing and the most challenging thing for him. Because you talk about the 10 Commandments, thou shalt not steal. And if you live in a society where stealing and getting away with it is the highest thing in that society, it's like, how do you witness? Where do you start in a context like that to bring Christianity to a group of people that are going to look at you like you're falling off, you have a third leg growing out of your nose, or something like that. It's just bizarre. Anyway, but if you treat your neighbor poorly, if you steal something, if something that was entrusted to you gets broken, if you find your neighbor's property and you don't give it back to your neighbor, anything that you do with your neighbor, you must give it back. And you have to add a 20% tax to it. And so that's a huge advantage to not take anything from your neighbor, because once you're found out, it's going to cost you more. And so don't even just do it to begin with. Don't extort. I mean, what is extorting your neighbor, right? Extorting is getting an exorbitant amount for something. It's what car dealers do when they overinflate the price. During COVID, a lot of cars were hard to find. And so a lot of car dealerships put a 20 or 30% extortion tax on the cost of a car. And, people were paying it, which is even the worst thing. Because the worst thing for an extortionist is to let them get away with it. Anyway, my understanding is that those car prices have come way down. There's no more extortion. But if you do extort, then you have to add 20%. Then you have to go to the priest and give him an offering. So there's another price you have to pay. You have to get something from the flock, like a ram, and give it to the priest. The priest kills it, the blood on the altar, and then sacrifices it, offering to God and all that sort of thing. So basically, the bottom line is there is a way to get right with God, with yourself and your neighbor, if you do any of these things against your neighbor, but it's going to cost you more. And so don't even do it to begin with. And if you do it, here's the price you have to pay, which is good. You want downward pressure that you don't do these things. Downward pressure is a good thing. All right. Verse 8, we're going to go into another type of offering. This is called the burnt offering. The Lord said to Moses, give Aaron and his sons this command. These are the priests. These are the regulations for the burnt offering. The burnt offering is to remain on the altar hearth throughout the night till morning, and the fire must be kept burning on the altar. The priest shall then put on his linen cloths with linen undergarments next to his body, and shall remove the ashes of the burnt offering that the fire is consumed on the altar, and place them beside the altar. Then he is to take off these clothes and put on others, and carry the ashes outside the camp to a place that is ceremonial clean. The fire on the altar must be kept burning. It must not go out, for every morning the priest is to add firewood and arrange the burnt offering on the fire and burn the fat of the fellowship offerings on it. The fire must be kept burning on the altar continuously. It must not go out. So this is on the altar of God. The fire, there must be some fire that goes, like an eternal flame that goes on the altar. We have in many churches still a semblance of this. If you go to some churches, sometimes they'll have a candle, a votive candle, somewhere in that church that they call the eternal flame. And the eternal flame is supposed to represent Jesus and his eternal life. And in the church I grew up with, it was a red votive candle surrounded by a brass structure that the candle sat in, and it had these brass strands coming up off of it, these chains, and it went all the way up to the top of the church, and then down there was this, you could undo it from the side of the wall, and you could lower the candle, and you could replace the candle or add more oil to it. This was an oil candle. And I remember at one point being in the sanctuary where I believe it was Pastor Marth, one of the pastors when I was growing up, was changing that candle. oil or adding more oil to the candle. So it came down and he blew out the flame, took off the candle and put in more oil to it. And I said, "What are you doing? That's the eternal flame." He goes, "Well, yeah, but how are you going to change this oil? Blow out the flame." I'm like, "Well, but it's called an eternal flame. It's eternal. You got to take the flame off with another candle, then do all your work and then relight it, so the flame." And he looks at me like, "What, are you crazy? That's a lot of work. That's not how we do it." So I thought that was really, really interesting. It is an eternal flame during Sunday morning. Other than that, it's not necessarily an eternal flame. But here on the altar of God, you are to keep the altar fire going. It must be kept going. And you add firewood and arrange the fire so that it never goes out. I'm sure there were times it did go out. For whatever reason, there may have been times that on that priest's watch, the fire may go out. And if that's the case, it's not the end of the world. It's not like Jesus is going to come back and kill you. But the desire of God is that fire keeps going forever. And part of that may have been that it was maybe very difficult to create a fire. So when the offering was to happen, you had to be ready to go on a moment's notice to be able to do the offering. So perhaps that's the reason why this was supposed to happen that way. All right. The next one is called the grain offering. But I think that is a long section. So I think we'll end it here. So when we start again, we'll be on chapter 6, verse 14. And let's go ahead and close in prayer. Gracious God, we do thank you that you have provided for our atonement. And you've done this through your son, Jesus. Until we meet again, keep us in your grace. In his name we pray. Amen. All right. So we'll end it there. I imagine we'll get more rain today. I think I heard that it was going to start raining on Thursday or Friday, maybe tomorrow. But we got rain yesterday, and I didn't have it in the forecast at all. So you just never know from day to day. When we go to New Orleans next week, right now it's at a 20% chance of rain for every time we're there. So I know that at least one of the 5 days we're going to get rain. So I got to bring all the rain stuff to make sure that I'm protected against the rain. Rain is not bad. There's no such thing as bad weather. It's only bad clothing. And that's what my lovely wife, whose birthday today, says. All right. So I pray you have a blessed day in the Lord. And thank you so much for joining me. And we'll see you tomorrow. Take care.